I suppose I should start by remarking that it's very easy for the left to denounce right-wing political correctness on campus, and it's very easy for the right to denounce left-wing political correctness on campus. The issue is whether all of us can stand up for all free speech, including the speech we disagree with.
Our first witness is Mr. Stanley Kurtz.
So long as students are permitted to silence the speech of visiting speakers or their fellow students without disciplinary consequences, the growing threat to campus free speech will never be overcome.
Any principles or legislation must consider the fact that public universities must maintain a commitment to the marketplace of ideas. I realize that critical race theorists and others question the marketplace of ideas, saying that there is not equal access to the market. And while this may be true in some circumstances, where can we have a true marketplace of ideas but at a public university campus? We must deal with competing viewpoints.
Hostility is increasing against certain viewpoints and beliefs on campuses. A university is supposed to facilitate the free exchange of ideas to advance our understanding of the world. Students are better off when they're exposed to ideas or viewpoints they do not share. And learning to respect speakers with whom a student disagrees is vitally important to advancing a diverse and tolerant culture. And the First Amendment commands public universities to respect these principles. Yet now we see a culture of free speech zones, islands surrounded by an ocean of university facilities and locations where safe spaces, microaggression, and trigger are code words justifying censorship.
On college campuses, what's your recommendation? The private schools, should they be allowed to focus as much as they choose on their particular religions, whether it's Christianity or Judaism or any other religious group?
Two recommendations, Mr. Chairman. First of all, regarding private institutions, Congress does have authority under the Spending Clause to condition eligibility for federal funding on private universities respecting speech in such a manner that if they were to suppress speech in a way that would be a civil rights violation, actionable by the Justice Department if done by a public university, that could be a trigger, to use the word appropriately, for reducing or eliminating certain types of federal funding. The amount of federal funds that Ivy League universities are now receiving is so astounding that in just a few years, they would be in a financial position where all of their students could attend for free if they would allow that to go. So I believe that's something that would really get their attention.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Lushanoff, part of the things that I've noticed about this debate is that there seems to be a declining support for First Amendment values amongst younger people. And so we deal with the issues that you guys ably deal with because we want free expression on the campus. That's just a good thing. But it seems to me the result of some of these codes and restrictions has been that's kind of what people are now socialized to, or maybe they're even advocating. So can you speak to the issue of the extent to which younger people have really walked away from core First Amendment values and are actually supportive of having a lot of these restrictions?
Absolutely, and that's the thing that keeps me up at night right now. So I've been doing this since 2001, and for the overwhelming majority of my career, the people that were on the, in my opinion, wrong side of freedom of speech were campus administrators. Sometimes faculty were pro-speech code. The single best constituency on campuses were always the students themselves. Often poor and minority students, often non-traditional age students have been some of our best allies. I don't know precisely what happened, but somewhere around 2013, 2014, we started seeing a shift to students demanding freedom of speech for themselves, understanding that it was really important for them to have that, to what I dubbed freedom from speech that they dislike. And this is the most distressing cultural change I've seen in my career. But that means what we have to do, we have to think about ways of getting not just the law, not just the First Amendment in front of them, but we have to get the philosophy of freedom of speech in front of more students. I think it's crucial for students to know, for example, the incredibly important role that freedom of speech played in the gay rights movement, in the civil rights movement, in all of American history. When it was recognized, it has been a force for innovation and progress. But I think students are primarily taught that freedom of speech is the argument of the bully, the bigot, and the robber baron, and that's completely inappropriate. So I think I'm constantly thinking of ways to get in front of people at a younger age. I was even toying with the idea of writing a children's book about freedom of speech, but we have to be creative in teaching this as a profound philosophy that helps protect deep pluralism in our society.
Yeah, Mr. Kurtz, I think you get at this a little bit. I mean, if you look at like the Yale situation that happened, I mean, you have the Woodward reports, the Standard. Clearly, you know, they've walked very far away from that. But as you watch those videos, it seemed to me that that was really led by the students, some of these really radical students, and that the administration more caved rather than stand up for the values of the Woodward report. And I think that may track with your view about, you know, they're not really holding some of these people accountable. So can you address that?
Yes, Congressman DeSantis. As I emphasized in my remarks, I think the administrators caving is very much at the heart of the problem, although it's absolutely true that we have a generational difficulty now, and Greg Lukianoff has discussed that both in his writings and today very well. And so I think we have to intervene in this sector now, and you mentioned the Woodward report. The Woodward report was published in 1974, and it gave a history of a series of attacks on free speech that had occurred at Yale going back to 1963. These were pretty much attacks from the left against the right. The problematic pattern, the McCarthyism of the 50s, was a very big problem, but beginning in the early 60s, the problem went the other way. So we have to realize this problem on campus has been going on for more than 5 decades, and it's getting worse now, and administrators are still caving. That's why I've suggested legislative intervention at both the state and the federal level. Ordinarily, you try to take a hands-off posture and see if a sector could right itself. But what's happened now is that for literally 5.5 decades, the problem has been getting worse. I think legislators, ultimately, their first responsibility is to protect the rights of their constituents. So I think it's time to intervene.
Well, we're sending a lot of money. I mean, so that's really why we have a role. If we weren't funding anything, then I would just say we just stay out of it. But if we're going to be subsidizing these types of forums that are not free speech, infused with free speech values, then it becomes an issue.
Wouldn't requiring colleges to punish students, possibly with expulsion, for shouting down offensive speakers itself violate student free speech rights? What do you think of that, sir?
It could be. It'd have to be analyzed on a case-by-case basis.
Correct.
I do think that you'd have to have a clear standard of something akin to substantial disruption. Anytime you have punishment for a student for speaking out, I think there has to be clearly delineated standards, or we run afoul of due process concerns. And the last thing we would want to do is to have a zero-tolerance mentality that is infecting many K-12 school districts and superimpose that on the college and university level.
If a harassment policy model on the Title IX standard would pass constitutional muster, why haven't more colleges and universities, particularly public ones, adopted its severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive requirements?
That's a terrific question, and the answer is that the first thing is that they believe falsely that by having a more expansive definition of harassment, or for that matter, for having speech zones, for example, that they're protecting themselves from legal liability. And this is a fear that's fed into by what's known as the risk management industry, which have consultants which more or less say, definitely, cover yourselves. And this is made worse by the growth in bureaucracy on campus. So you have full-time employees who are trying to figure out ways to regulate every aspect of student life, and they over-regulate. Political correctness, of course, is real, so there are people who actually do want to protect people's feelings, but there's also ignorance of the law is a problem. So FIRE works closely with administrators all the time, trying to make sure they understand, again, both the law and philosophy behind it. And unfortunately, the fifth factor that's new is that students seem to be demanding, some relatively small number of students nonetheless, but seem to be demanding these new codes. The definition that we propose comes directly from the Supreme Court. It's never going to be overturned, and it does actually deal with cases of serious harassment. Now, the one last thing is, the trick, though, is to tell universities that it should be no less or no more than Davis, because the heartbreaking thing, looking at these policies sometimes, is you'll see a perfectly constitutional harassment policy in one section, and then the other section they say things like inappropriately directed laughter. I'm working on a book right now, and I had to spend a lot of time watching some of the recent situation, for example, at UC Berkeley when the riots broke out. And the thing that scared me the most about that was that it wasn't just merely shouting someone down, it was actually responding with violence. People were hit in the face with flagpoles, people were maced, people were struck, there was pools of blood that protesters were trying to clean up. And I felt genuinely scared watching that, because they were very lucky that nobody got killed. And when we start actually making the transition from merely shouting down is surely bad enough, but when it becomes we have to do more, we have to physically attack these people, we've entered a situation that makes me genuinely quite scared.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, and I think it kind of falls on us when we allow people to be shouted down.
Right.
If we don't draw the line there, then we invite what follows it.
As for an example where people absolutely should have been arrested, what happened at Berkeley? By not doing that, they encourage bad behavior in the future.
Agreed.
Let me ask what you see as the biggest danger in our college campuses, and how would you recommend we specifically take steps to stop it or prevent it?
As I said in my testimony, I think the shout-downs are really fundamental at this point. They're spectacular. The news travels across the country through media of all kinds, and so they have a kind of contagious effect. And that's why I think the state and federal legislative proposals I mentioned are necessary, at least in some form, and that they've got to include something about the shout-downs.
But if it's just the shout-downs, couldn't that be the local authorities just make sure there are no shout-downs or usher them out?
Well, unfortunately, the local authorities, who are the university administrators or the police that they choose to call or not to call in, aren't doing anything. That is the real problem, is that the administrators who ought to be enforcing the First Amendment on their public college and university campuses really aren't doing that. And this has been going on for decades.
So it's like George Wallace refusing to follow the Constitution required federal action until people started following, correct? Mr. Luckenoff, would you agree, or?
It's a big grand question. I wanted to give sort of bigger answers to it on what can be done. Now, the most important thing that Congress can do is help fix the legal incentives that actually make it easier for university general counsels to justify speech codes, to justify erring on the side of censorship rather than free speech. There's a lot I think Congress can do about that. But there's deeper things that we need to do, which I mentioned before, which is teach philosophy of freedom of speech earlier. Create the right expectations to students when they come into school. Students should be taught when they come into, and University of Chicago, for example, does a very good job of this, saying, we believe in freedom of speech, it's an incredible vision, but that also includes that you do not have the right to shout down a speaker. You do not, and you certainly don't have the right to respond violently. And then we have to, probably the subtlest thing, but that we desperately need to do as a society, is we have to habituate people to listening to each other across lines of differences. That's something that institutions like higher education could actually be helping with. But I think what we're actually doing is we're encouraging people to talk inside their echo chambers instead of talk across lines of difference.
Yep. Mr. Hudson?
Limit Garcetti legislatively as applied in the academic and university context. Provide protection for enhanced protections for student journalists, and not allow the importation of standards from K through 12. Educate young people with civic education and give them an opportunity to live in an environment where they appreciate a constitutional democracy, and continue the work of groups like FIRE that limit overbroad free speech zones and overbroad and vague anti-harassment policies.
Mr. Kukowski.
First, thank you for sharing the rules regarding the pictures. And on that basis, I would say I believe it is a viewpoint-neutral, content-based restriction, which would survive either under a limited public forum analysis or that it could be associated as governmental speech. Regarding university campuses, once again, you're touching in your example on a subject matter which I've noted is singularly disfavored. And in that regard, again, I do believe there is spending clause legislation that can be used to encourage private universities to act like public universities. I believe that the Justice Department Civil Rights Division could start investigating public universities where they are engaging in censorship of speech. And finally, Congress needs to consider what can be done to help protect the ability of individuals and groups to be able to get lawyers, whether paid or pro bono, because again, there is an increasing boycott movement right now that if you take on certain cases, there are major corporations that are subject to Congress's Commerce Clause power that will drop you as a law firm.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, thanks for letting me.
Corey, I would point out as we conclude this hearing that at the last straw poll in Ames, I had an individual come from behind me, reach around and grab my microphone and try to scream and yell and speak into my microphone. I didn't see him coming. I wrestled the microphone out of his hands, back into mine, and I said, "Get your own microphone." So I think that's a relevant narrative to conclude today's hearing, and I want to thank all the witnesses, not only for your testimony, but for your response to the questions, and thank the panelists for your participation and the staff. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. This hearing is now adjourned.